Hi, in this Unity tutorial we will be learning how to make a simple inventory system that lets you pick up items from the game world, track those items in the inventory and show them in the user interface, and drop the items back to the game world. Our inventory system is built around a few key components that interact with each other. The first component is the item class, which acts as a blueprint for all in-game items. It stores all of the items' data like the ID, name, description, etc. Managing all of these items is the inventory class. It keeps track of what the player has collected and handles adding and removing items, as well as detecting item pickups. To keep the code organized, both the item and the inventory classes have their own UI classes. These take care of displaying items in the interface and allowing the player to interact with them. Finally, there's the DroppedItem class, which represent items that exist in the game world before being picked up. It ensures that the items have the right data when the player interacts with them. Now that we have an overview of our system, let's take a look at the code. In the Item.cs script, we define a class called Item that inherits from a scriptable object. This allows us to create assets in Unity for different items in our game. Using Create Asset Menu attribute, we can easily add new items through the Unity menu by right-clicking and selecting Create, rumpled code, Item. Inside of the Item class, we have four public variables. The ID, the unique ID of the item, description, a short description about the item, the icon, which is a sprite that's going to be used in our user interface, and a prefab, which is going to be instantiated in our game world. With these variables, we can create a variety of items, each with its own unique properties and visuals. The system is also easily expandable and customizable, so don't be afraid to experiment. The inventory system handles picking up items, keeping track of our inventory, and then dropping items back into the game world. Taking a look at the variables at the top, we have a reference to the inventory UI class, an audio source that's attached to our player character, a dropped item prefab, which is going to be instantiated every time a player drops a prefab, regardless of which item they drop. We have two audio clips, pick up item audio and drop item audio. And finally, we have our inventory variable, which is a serialized dictionary, where the key is a string and the value is the item class. Every time the player character enters a trigger, we compare its tag. If the tag is equal to dropped item, we then get the component dropped item from that collider, and then we check if it's already been picked up. If it has not been picked up, we can then add that item to the inventory, then set the item to be picked up to be true. We can destroy the collider game object inside of the game world, and then last we can play the one-shot audio of the pickup item audio. Next is the add item function. When adding a new item to the inventory, we generate a new unique inventory ID for the picked up item. We use this ID instead of the item's own ID to allow us to have multiple instances of the same item type in our inventory without having conflicting IDs. Once we have generated the inventory ID, we add it to the dictionary as the key along with the item data as the value. Lastly, the drop item function creates a new object from the dropped item prefab and initializes it with the dropped item data. It removes the item from the dictionary, notifies the UI class to remove the item from the UI, and it plays a sound as feedback to the player. The dropped item class handles item representation in the game world. The auto start variable controls whether or not the item is automatically initialized when the game starts, or if it should be initialized manually via a script. The enabled pickup delay variable defines how long after the item is initialized the player has to wait before it can be picked up. The item variable holds the item data. Lastly, the picked up variable holds the dropped item's picked up state. When initializing the dropped item, we instantiate the item prefab and set its position and rotation. Finally, a coroutine is launched to create a delay before enabling the trigger collider. Each item in the user interface has an ItemUI component. At the top of the class, we have a reference to the image component to display the item's icon and the button component of the object itself. When initializing the component, we pass it the inventory ID of the item data, as well as an action we want to invoke when we want to remove the item from the inventory. We then add a new listener on the button's onClick event, which will tell the inventory class to remove the item. The Inventory UI class handles creating new item prefabs and adding them to the scroll view content in the user interface. When adding an item, we create a new instance from the prefab, set its parent to be the content object of the scroll view, and add it to the dictionary just like in the original inventory class. Finally, the item UI object is initialized. When removing an item, it is removed from the dictionary and the game object gets deleted from the UI. Now that we know how the code works, let's go to Unity and see how our prefabs are set up, starting with the simplest, and that's the item scriptable object. We have 3 different items: the binoculars, the crowbar, and the snapback cap. Each one of these references a prefab for the game object and a sprite for the icon. It also has an ID and a description. Next, we have the dropped item prefab. This is the prefab that gets instantiated every time the player drops an item to the game world. It has a disabled capsule collider, which is set to be a trigger. It has a rotator script that will just spin the item around its y-axis. And it has the dropped item component. It's currently set to auto start to be false because we do not want them to auto start if they are dropped by the player. We only want the in-game world ones that are pre-existing to auto start. And we have the enabled pickup delay. By default, it's set to 1 second over here. The next thing we have is a UI item prefab, which is a simple UI button, which I have designed to fit neatly inside of this scroll view. And the only thing it has is an item UI component, which if we open the prefab, we will see that the image points to the icon image and that the button points to the game object itself. In our scene view, we have our basic player with the inventory component attached to it. This inventory component also references the inventory UI component attached to the scroll view, which is this little scroll view right over here. It references the player's audio source. It also references the drop item prefab, which gets instantiated every time the player drops an item. And it also references 2 audio clips, so for the pickup audio and the drop item audio. The next thing in our scene view is the inventory UI component, which is attached to a scroll view. It has a reference to the UI item prefab, which when instantiated gets attached to the content object, which is the content of the scroll view. And it also has a reference to the basic player inventory. Now that we have set up our scene, let's see how it works in the Unity editor. I'm gonna hit play. And I have set up a couple of items over here. So right now if we click on our player and go to the inventory, we can see that it has 0 keys and 0 values. So if we pick up an item, it says we have 1 key, and this is a random ID, and 1 value, which is the item, and it says it's pointing to the crowbar. Now, if I go back over here and pick up another one, we can also open the canvas and see the content and see that we have 2 items in our inventory. And let's say we click one of them, and there we go, we have just 1, and we have picked it up immediately. So there we go, 1 item, and then 0 items. And if we go back to our basic player, you'll see that we have nothing in our inventory. Thank you all for watching. I hope you learned something today. Feel free to ask any questions in the comments below, and I hope you have a nice day. Bye bye.